everybody. Math today is going to look a little bit different. It does have these two attachments that you can definitely use. I'll post them to Seesaw so you have them. I'll also encourage you guys, if you are printing them out, to go ahead and actually cut them out. I'm going to do a sample of that in a little bit here. Cut them out, print out as many copies as you can. You can print it in black and white so you don't have to waste all your colored ink, but see how many times. Don't just draw the lines, actually cut them out into the shapes, because I find, even as an adult, that drawing it is easier than actually cutting it out. So making sure that I'm cutting out this circle and I'm actually partitioning it into the three pieces so that I can see, do those three pieces actually line up or not? A lot of times, even for me, especially when I do thirds, my thirds tend to be that the piece down here, when I cut it out, it tends to be a lot smaller than the other two pieces. So I have to think to myself about making it a little bit wider when I'm partitioning this into fractions, because remember, as a fraction, we need it to be as equal as possible. So today I'm going to show you a real quick, easy recipe. Normally we would use all sorts of Play-Doh, and we would have so much hands-on manipulatives and things like that to work with fractions, because I think that's the best way to learn these kinds of concepts is through hands-on practice. So take this out, don't just draw it online, okay? Like actually cut it out. That's why I'm not posting it just yet. I will post it if you want it, but I'm going to encourage you to cut it out and actually manipulate them. Or if you have something like I have these little English muffins, they would be great to practice with. If you're making a sandwich for breakfast, for lunch, that would be a great thing to practice cutting up into fourths or halves. Get creative with what you have in your house. Try to make it fun. If you can, I'm going to show you how to make a recipe for an easy, super easy salt dough. I did send a recipe yesterday for salt dough using crayons to make it colorful. That required some cream of tartar, which I didn't have on hand, so I looked up a different recipe and we're going to try it out today. The other great thing about being in the kitchen is that you really get a hands-on practice for fractions. So for example, what I'm going to be working with today is 1 cup, and I'm going to also be working with needing 3 cups of water. I'm sorry, 3/4 cups of water. So having 1 whole cup, I can't really estimate. Now my measuring cup does actually have the marks on it to keep it as accurate as possible. When we're cooking, we need to be super accurate. So since I didn't have a 3/4 cup, I know that I'm going to need to use my 1/4 cup 3 times. 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 is going to equal 3/4. And what that means is it would need 4 of these to fill up this cup. Since I only need 3, I'm going to use this small one. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this up with 1 cup of salt, 2 cups of flour, and then I'm going to slowly add the water to my mixture. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'll pause. All right, so I've gone ahead and just mixed in, I went ahead and started with the flour and salt and just mixed it in with a spoon. And then what I'm doing is I'm adding in the water. It says to add in the water slowly, depending on the temperature outside, depending on if there's a lot of moisture in the air, you could need a little bit more water or a little bit less. So I've gone ahead and started with my 2/4 of a cup. And then I just started adding in part of the last 1/4 of a cup, and I'm noticing that I'm getting a good shape of dough. So here you can see it starting to form. What it says next is to knead. What that just means is play with it, squish it, keep going until you get more of a normal consistency. Mine's getting there. When you can start forming it and it takes all the extra off of your hands, then you know that you're getting to a good place. What I'm noticing though is at the bottom of my bowl, I still have a lot of flour left over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to add some more water to this mixture. I had a little bit of blue food dye on my hands from earlier, so it's actually transferring to the dough. You can definitely add that. I would pour it in with the water, put a couple drops in with the water, but know that it will probably end up getting your hands quite messy as well. So making sure that as you're working with this dough, you're working with the measurements. It does make a fair amount, so this is about half of what I have in my bowl, which is more than enough. So if you want to practice with less, you could do 1/2 of a cup of salt, 1 cup of flour, and then I would start out with probably 1/3 of a cup of water and then just add a little bit by little. Your dough is a salt dough and it is going to have kind of a gritty texture, but it is going to be a good tool for us to use to practice some fractions. So I'm going to keep working with this and I'll be right back. So now I'm ready I did try to add some food dye, as you can tell, and that's just a warning for everybody. But when I'm trying to form my shapes, what we tend to want to do is make a sphere, and we want to make a ball. And then as we're trying to work with fractions with that, it becomes a 3D shape and it becomes a little bit more of a challenge. The shapes that we're practicing putting into fractions are on our plane shapes. So we want to make sure that our dough is as flat as possible. And what I'm going to do is I'm just flattening it out. And usually with the Play-Doh, we actually will just use the Play-Doh container to cut out a perfect circle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of my measuring cups, and I'm just going to take it. Let's see if I can do this with you guys here. All right, and I'm just going to take it and I'm going to put it on top and kind of shake it to get out my circle. It's not going to be 100% perfect, but at least then I have a circle that is a little bit easier to partition into my fractions. For today's activity, it does ask you to partition them into halves, thirds, and fourths, and demonstrate them in as many ways as you can. So when you're practicing your fourths in particular, there's oftentimes ways to partition it differently. So the great thing about having the dough is I don't have to reprint these out 10 different times. I can just have my dough, cut it out, try it again, squish back together, do it all over again. So when we're talking about our fractions, we're going to partition. And what partitioning means is making sure that we are dividing or cutting our shape into those equal parts. So today I'm asking you to do at least thirds, fourths, and halves and see how many different ways you can come up with them. So I've got my salt dough here. I've got just this little spatula that I'm going to use. I would just partition it into halves, into fourths, and into thirds. When you're partitioning your thirds, those tend to be the ones that I have the most trouble with. So what I like to do is I like to put a dot in the very center so that I can remember that I need to stop when I get there, and then I'm going to widen out my fractions. Now I'm going to intentionally do what I normally would do, which is partition them into thirds that way. If you can see here, it looks like they're partitioned fairly equally. However, when I take these two pieces and fold them on top of each other, they're fairly equal, a little bit larger over here, but then when I take this third one, I can see that it is a lot smaller. And I tend to see that happening a lot. I've always done that myself even when I'm practicing with my fractions. You want to go again until you stop about halfway, and then we want to go wider on the bottom. So we want to actually cut out our piece so that it is wider than we might think. When you're partitioning this way, you could actually overlap it and see that it's not quite going to work out for me this time, but I can see that if I just split it into thirds, I'm not getting all pieces equal. And the problem with that is that that means that they're not actually true thirds. So while you're working with your thirds today, that's definitely going to be one that I want you to practice multiple times to see if you can get it as equal as possible. That's why the salt dough is going to come in super handy, because you can just squish it back together. Use that cookie cutter if you have one. If you don't have a cookie cutter and the measuring cup is not working, just a glass works great as well to get that perfect circle shape. And then when you're doing squares, if you have something square that you can trace, great. If you don't, a square is a lot easier to get a little bit more equal than a circle typically. As you can see, my circle is not so great now. When you're doing your fourths, I do want to challenge you to think about partitioning them. We think of it the traditional way as the window. We could turn it this way. Is there another way that you could partition fourths? Could you do vertical slices into fourths? Could you do horizontal slices? Could you even try diagonal lines? See what you can do with your fourths to create as many different ways as you can. I hope you guys are having fun. I hope that you enjoy making salt dough. If you do, if you make anything fun out of it, There is a recipe that I'll post. The one that I shared today is super easy. It also does recommend that what you can do if you don't put food dye in, so you can actually bake it in the oven at 180 degrees and it will dry out. And then once it's dried out, then what you can do is you can go over it and paint it. So it's actually a fun way to make all sorts of different crafts during this time. So I hope that you have fun with this recipe and you have fun with fractions today.